I have prepared a PowerPoint presentation. I don't usually lecture with PowerPoint. I like to move around and get excited, and I'll try to get you to participate a little bit. But what I've done basically is I've pieced together some wonderful art and a few quotes. And as Dan said, I feel that I'm not quite worthy to be here. You're all holier than me. I'm a philosopher. I'm not a theologian. And I am a Christian, a believing Christian. I'm a Catholic. It's very important, I think, to have theological views and read Scripture. And in fact, I've added Scripture to the talk today. But in my professional life, I'm basically a secular philosopher. I specialize in Aristotle. I have actually a book that's going to be coming out that's about Christianity and literature, so I do talk about religion. But I particularly specialize in the ancient world, in Aristotle, Plato, Socrates, the pre-Socratics. So what am I going to do today? I was a little bit intimidated, but what I will try to do is, and I guess if there's one lesson to take from the talk, it's that the philosophical tradition, which is based on natural reason, so it's reason, argument, concepts, principles, without the help of revelation, although revelation, Christian revelation, eventually becomes involved. My message is that the philosophical tradition isn't as different from the religious Christian or Judeo-Christian tradition as people tend to assume. I think as Christians, what happens in the world is it's a rather sad state of affairs, and Christians, particularly you, most of you are rather young, at least compared to me. I teach young students, young believers, young Christians. They are in a difficult situation today. It tends to be a very negative environment at the university. It's very hostile towards religion. And one has the impression that if you believe in religion, you're dumb, that there's something somehow that's gone wrong. I'll talk a little bit about why that's the case. The message today is basically, look, if you think back at the great thinkers in the tradition, what you find out is the great thinkers, the great philosophers, in fact, they have views that are remarkably similar to Christianity. They're not the same, and the details are different, and we can talk about that if you want during the talk. But what I want to focus in on is the way in which talk about ethics, talk about love, talk about friendship, talk about marriage in the philosophical tradition as a whole, the mainstream tradition. It's remarkable, in fact, how similar, how close it is to what we find in Christianity. So I've named the talk Athens and Jerusalem, Love and the Tradition. I think the spirit of the talk, Justin Martyr, one of the early church fathers, said, all that is true belongs to us. Because there were problems at the beginning of the tradition. What are we supposed to do with philosophers like Aristotle and Plato? They were clearly not Christian in the sense that they were before Christian revelation. And there were debates in the church. Some people wanted to say a pox on philosophy. That's not helpful. It's secular, it's Roman, it's Greek. They were pagans. They were pagans. They were noble pagans, but they were pagans. Other people, like Justin Martyr, said, no, whatever is true and wise in that tradition, if it's true, it comes in some way or other from God, and so it belongs to us as much as it belongs to anyone else. The quotes, by the way, you'll see a little, I'll show you a little bit of Greek. All these quotes of the ancient thinkers anyways have been translated. That's all right. We'll look a little bit at Greek because you're all doctors and all used to big terminology. This is the School of Athens. What it just represents the Western tradition. And this is what I want to talk about. It's in the Vatican. It's by Raphael. There's all sorts of philosophers. Actually, I've got my pointer. That's right. There's all sorts of philosophers depicted: Aristotle, Plato, Socrates, student Alcibiades, Xenophon is over there, Heraclitus, Pythagoras, Diogenes the Cynic, so on and so forth. No, just so that you get a sense, what's this about? It's somebody in the Renaissance, so much later, trying to put down in a fresco painting the heritage, the intellectual heritage of the Western tradition. And of course, this is in the Vatican. Raphael is, of course, a Christian painter, but this is at a time where there's a rebirth of interest in the humanities in Roman and Greek times. And so what he's trying to do is put on one wall in one school. It's Athens, because of course Athens was the center of intellectual ferment in philosophy in the ancient times. So he's put all these thinkers together, and what we're going to do is we're going to go through and look at some of them and try to make sense of them in relation to Christianity. That's the centerpiece, Plato and Aristotle. A little Greek word here, anamnesis. It's a Greek word for recollection. And Plato thought that the way we learned was through remembering. He actually thought we had a past life, and when we learned things, we remembered what was in a past life, and that's how we could make sense of the world. I want to talk about remembering today. I want to talk about remembering what great thinkers in the past taught, and so it's worthwhile to think of learning as a kind of recollection, of thinking back at what, in some sense, we already know. This is it's a mezzotint, which is a kind of sort of an engraving. It's not too important who did it. There was an artist called William Firth. It's about 1750. Why do I have the slide up? It would represent why at universities, I think, why in the intellectual world, why today there is so much suspicion, there is so much unhappiness, contempt even of religion. It represents the Enlightenment. And the Enlightenment, beginning 1500, 1600, 1700, that is where in history there was a break with the past. There was a break with the past, and what came in was science. And this is a mezzotint by William Firth. They're doing an experiment. You can see up here, there's a little bird, pigeon, or a dove, and it's basically a vacuum pump. And it's an artist's rendition of someone sort of doing an experiment to find out about air. What happens is, to find out how important air is, they pump the air out and the dove dies. Okay? I thought it was a very sort of informative print. It's called The Philosopher, something like The Philosopher Doing an Experiment. There's the mad philosopher, the natural philosopher, which is where science comes from. Science comes from philosophy. Of course, you're all, or most of you are doctors or dentists, so you're all comfortable with science. But the problem is that science can't respond to everything in our lives. We need a spiritual dimension. We need moral beliefs. We need a belief in free will. We need beliefs about what's going to happen after we die. And science is very important. You all believe in science. I believe in science. I have a degree in science, actually. But at the same time, when you think that that's all there is to explaining the world, you run into problems with religion. because religion depends on faith, because it depends on believing in things that you can't see. You can't perform an experiment. You can't measure or weigh morality. It's hard to make sense of the world in a human way with science. What's happened is the scientific worldview has come in. We have reductionism, which is all around us, which wants to reduce everything to science. And it's pushed away religion, but it's also pushed away philosophy. What I want to do is go back and show you, hey, what Christianity teaches, and I think Christianity has the best idea about love. Nevertheless, already in the tradition, early on, even with the pagan philosophers, what we find is intimations. We find suggestions, hints, arguments, ideas, which remarkably, in a way, I think, find their fulfillment in Christianity. But we have to get over the Enlightenment bias. So, Calvin and Hobbes, the great cartoon Watterson, who does Calvin and Hobbes, actually has a degree in philosophy. I think you can tell when you look at his cartoons. So this is a little cartoon about Calvin having a postmodern crisis. Now, you're all in science, but I, live in an arts faculty, so to speak. So what's going on? How are you doing on your New Year's resolutions? I didn't make any. See, in order to improve oneself, one must have some idea of what's good, and that implies certain values. But as we all know, values are relative. Every system of belief is equally valid, and we need to tolerate diversity. And by the way, this is the general gist of of what's going on in universities right now. Virtue isn't better than vice, it's just different. And he goes on and says he's, so much for morality. What I want to tell you is you might get the impression if you just read the newspapers or you pay attention to the media or YouTube that this is where philosophy brings you. It's not. There's always been a certain element of skepticism in philosophy. That's good because we need to ask questions. We can't come up with answers unless we first have questions. But this kind of worldview that Watterson is mocking or making fun of, in fact, if you go to mainstream philosophy, that's not what it's about. Mainstream philosophy is about ideas like there is a transcendent, there is an objective morality, there is a God, and so on and so forth. And this represents sort of culturally what's going on today in certainly in arts faculties at probably every university. We have very soft arts faculties and sort of very hard scientific faculties. But this is just to show you here's an attitude that really doesn't fit very well with the tradition. So I want to go back to the tradition. What I thought I would do, first of all, and you'll have to remind me if I go on too long because I get excited. What I thought I would first do is to show you that some of the ideas that you find in Christianity, you can already find with the philosophers. I'm going to tell you a couple of stories, and then we'll talk about love. So, of course, this is from John's Gospel. Peace I leave with you, my peace I give you, and so on and so forth. And you'll notice that in the Gospel, peace, finding an inner peace that quenches all thirst, that satisfies, and satisfies not just now, and then you're thirsty afterwards, but as Jesus said to the Samaritan woman, a peace that's ever flowing, that's ever present there. That's an important part of the Christian tradition. Well, it's also an important part of the philosophical tradition. We don't need to look at all the details, but what this is a painting. This is a painting of Pierrot. Now, Pierrot was an ancient skeptic. But ancient skepticism wasn't like modern skepticism. It wasn't skepticism about religion. It was skepticism about knowledge, about philosophy. What I want to point out, in early philosophy, there were many different movements: the Stoics, the Skeptics, the Cynics, the Epicureans, and so on and so forth. They were all trying to find, what were they trying to find? There's a word here, this is a Greek word, ataraxia. What the word means is, literally translated, it means unperturbedness. It means water without any waves. And this is Pierrot, and there's a little story. The first stories of the great thinkers, they're not really text, journal articles. They're somebody telling an anecdote, and there's an anecdote that was taught about Pierrot, who seems to have been kind of a mystic. And he used to go off into the woods by himself and spend lots of time by himself. But he was on a ship in the old world. They traveled a lot by ship. He was on a ship, and the ship was in a storm. And everybody was upset. You can see people throwing their hands up and their expressions on their face of fright. And Pierrot is supposedly, look carefully at the boat. You see there's a little pig here. All right? They see the little pig. It's eating some straw right there. There's Pierrot, and he's talking to the ship's captain. And I'll read this story for you. Supposedly, everybody's being worried about drowning, and the pig was eating quietly. Because why? Because pigs are animals, and they don't know enough, because they can't do anything about the storm. And allegedly, Pierrot pointed to the pig and said, "The wise man will be like this little pig here. He will be undisturbed in the storm. He will achieve ataraxia, unperturbedness. Will we die? Will the ship go down? Well, it's for the gods to know. It's not for us to fret about, to be worried about. Basically, what we have to do is cultivate, through a kind of skepticism, which I won't explain here, but what we have to do is try and achieve some kind of inner peace. So you see in early ethics, you see this real preoccupation with how do I find inside myself some source of peace that will last, that will continue, whatever is going on in the world around us. And of course, in the gospel, that's what Jesus is offering us. Okay, I want to talk about Plato. This is a painting of when there was the rebellion of the slaves with Spartacus and Roman times, and supposedly they crucified. There were 6,000 slaves they caught. The road to Rome was lined with crucifixions. This is sort of a difficult truth about Christianity, but of course the crucifixion, the passion, is a very important part of Christian belief. It may seem strange if we have this guy that comes down to earth and he's God made man, and how in the world is it that he ends up in such an ignominious fate? You have to understand, for the Romans, crucifixion was shameful. It wasn't only a horrible, torturous way to die. It was, you were at the bottom of the totem pole, so to speak. It was filthy, it was degrading, it was shameful. You were basically displayed. You were held up and displayed so people would walk by and mock you, and you were the lowest of the low. This is a little quote from The Republic by Plato. Of course, Plato, this is before Jesus. This is about 400, 500 years before Jesus. And the story in the Republic is, what is justice? And I'm not going to tell the whole story, but at the beginning of the dialogue, there comes a point where there were basically Plato's brothers are playing devil's advocate, Adamus and Glaucon, and they draw up a picture of the perfectly just man. And the remarkable thing is that the just man, his destiny sounds just like Jesus. The just man will have to endure the lash, the rack, chains, the branding iron in his eyes, and finally, after every extremity of suffering, he will be crucified. And so we'll learn his lesson not to merely appear just. The word that's used, the Greek word in that particular text, it has two meanings. Basically what happened is that in the ancient world, the Persians impaled people, the Romans crucified people. In Athens at that time, it seems both were practiced. Impaling, impale, crucify. It means to skewer. It means to put a spear through somebody. There were various ways of doing this. But what I want to point out is not so much, it's not an issue about the precise word, although it is remarkable. Well, the interesting thing is what Plato's interlocutors are saying is if you're just, you're going to be punished. If you're a really good person and you refrain from deceit and from dishonesty and manipulating others and power politics, what will happen is you will pay a price. And there's already a sense here. The important thing about impalement or crucifixion, and why Plato brings it up, it is, as you said, Terry, it's the worst form of penalty, of punishment that you can have. Now, I want to talk some more about this, but before I do, I'm going to introduce two other philosophers. This is Epictetus. He was a Roman Stoic. He started off as a slave. He was crippled because he was punished by his master. The early church fathers were very influenced by the Stoics. And I want to come back to something that Epictetus, he talks actually about punishment and how we should accept it. This is Diogenes, the cynic. The word cynic comes from the Greek word for dog, kuon. So he's often pictured, he lived in a barrel. He tried in some sense to have the simplest life possible. And I want to show you a quote by Epictetus about Diogenes, about the cynics. Epictetus, like Jesus, didn't write anything down. His student wrote things down. There's just another picture. You have the beautiful ladies, and there's Diogenes in his barrel, a kind of a taciturn, kind of a grumpy sort. Here is what Epictetus says about the cynics, the group of philosophers that followed Diogenes. Without God, of course, he's thinking of Zeus, but Zeus for the Stoics is an all sort of pervading God. They're not really polytheists. They really believe in one God, who sometimes sounds very much like God the Father. Without God, attempt nothing, and if he shall advise you, so if God sends you out on a mission, he's saying, be assured he intends you to become great or to receive many blows. Consider the amusing life of the cynic. He must be flogged like an ass, and when he is flogged, this is the important point, he must love those who flog him as if he were the father and the brother of all. So we already have a sense here. This is in the Roman tradition before Christianity has become pervasive and has taken over society. What is Epictetus saying? He is saying that if you're really a holy person and a good person, what should you do? You should be like Jesus on the cross. What did Jesus do on the cross? He said, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. He wasn't angry. He wasn't upset. He accepted his fate with equanimity, with ataraxia, actually. And here we have a Stoic philosopher, a pagan philosopher. He's effectively saying the same thing. A modern philosopher like Nietzsche, some of you must know about Nietzsche, who certainly was a strident anti-Christian. He says that Jesus on the cross is the best man, what he called the overman, the superman. Why? because he accepted his suffering, his fate, without rancor, without resentment, without hating people, without wanting to get back. Here we have, and I think Jesus on the cross is certainly the best example of this, but here we have Epictetus, and he's talking about flogging, which was sort of the next worst punishment, and he's saying, what should you do? You should love the people that flog you. That strikes me. Here is somebody who doesn't know about the Bible, doesn't know about Jesus, doesn't know about religion, and yet here we have in the tradition basically a similar kind of ethical, moral aspiration that's put forward as the ideal. Love the people that persecute you. And he goes on, I won't spend much time with, there's another quote there, but I think I'll jump over it. He says the problem is that what do we do when we're upset? He says we complain. We complain and we sort of say how this isn't fair. And, you say no if a man flogs you, but you stand in the public place and call out, Caesar, what do I suffer in the state of peace under thy protection, and so on and so forth. Except, and he's basically saying, forget about all that legalistic stuff and whatever, except him who sent the cynic down hither and whom he serves, namely Zeus, God the Father, the creator of the universe. Does the cynic call upon any other than Zeus? Is he not convinced that whatever he suffers, it is Zeus, it's God that designed that for him, and he suffers, quietly for God's sake, which is so the opposite of the way of the world, which is we complain and we say, why us? And, it's not fair, and so on and so forth. This is Socrates. Socrates, the ugliest man in the ancient world, supposedly. Really, that was his reputation. Very similar to a sort of a Jesus figure. He never wrote anything down. He was persecuted for his beliefs. He went to his death because of his philosophical beliefs. He didn't complain about it. He went cheerfully. He believed in God. In fact, he was a religious person. He seems to have been a monotheist, so somebody that believed in one God, unlike the Greek pantheon, of course, had many gods, and there's all sorts of stuff one could say about it. Again, I just want to show, to start with, that there's echoes of Christianity in all this philosophical tradition. This is a quote from Luke. Of course, the important thing is your soul. Don't be worried about who can kill your body. What's important is your soul. That's precisely what Socrates tried to live out and talked about and advised. His view, actually, is not entirely Christian, because the Platonic view thinks that the body is bad. Christianity, God took on a human body, and the body is good, but nevertheless, there is some noble sense that don't be preoccupied by physical things. This is from the Apology, his defense. I cared not a straw for death, and that my only fear was the fear of doing the unrighteous or unholy thing. This is a painting by Jacques-Louis David. He's about to drink the hemlock, right? Because he's punished to death, and the way they killed nobles in Athens was they gave them hemlock to drink, and he's about to take it, and he's pointing upwards to say, well, he's not 100% sure, but he's pretty certain there's a life to come, and what matters is not the physical world, but how you live your life morally. Now, Socrates is interesting. When I teach ethics, I'm fascinated by this always. This is the golden rule. And you might say that in ethics, the largest contribution or the most conspicuous contribution to ethics is the golden rule. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And I don't want you to get the wrong idea. I think Jesus, in a particular way, highlights, emphasizes, articulates this idea that morality is about reciprocity, about treating other people the way we want to be treated. And in effect, love, this is what love requires, that we treat everybody. We love ourselves. It's not that that's wrong, but we love other people in the same way. So this comes to the fore in the Christian tradition. But I want to show you that, in fact, you find it already in the philosophical tradition. Now, what's this? This is the Hammurabi Code. What I want to show you is that in ancient times, since time immemorial, the golden rule was not the way that people thought. What they thought is basically justice requires a measured out penalty that's equal to the crime. This is a stele, it's a code, and it has a bunch of laws written on it. It's from about 2000 BC. That's the top of it. You've got the sun god giving the laws to the Babylonian king, and it's one of the earliest legal systems that we have. What does the legal system say? If a man destroy the eye of another, they shall destroy his eye. If one break a man's bone, they shall break his bone. If one destroy the eye of a free man, he shall pay 1 gold mina. And there's an idea throughout all this legal system that basically you pay back evil with the same amount of evil. All right, and this is it's a retributive notion of justice, and it's there from time immemorial. And of course, you probably already know it's in the Old Testament. This is Leviticus. Fracture for fracture, eye for eye, tooth for tooth. The one who has inflicted the injury must suffer the same injury. Exodus. Eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot. Deuteronomy. Show no pity. Life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot. And this is not just Jewish, it's universal in the ancient world at the beginning of times. That's basically the way people thought justice should be served. Here what happens is at a certain point you get money taking sort of replacing the idea of physical violence done to someone. This is Socrates in the Republic, and he says, it is never right to harm anyone. It's a discussion about whether or not you should love your enemies, and his interlocutors are saying, well, you know, what the good person does is they love their friends and they hate their enemies. They do good things to their friends, and what do? They thwart, they oppose, they bring whatever is bad upon the heads of their enemies. And Socrates adamantly says, no, if you're a good person, you never do wrong to anyone else. No matter how much they're inflicting evil on you, you don't do that in return. One shouldn't return injustice or ill treatment to any human being, no matter how one may be treated by that person. Neither doing nor returning injustice is ever right. No one who is ill-treated should defend himself by retaliation. This is when Socrates is in prison, and his friends come because he's been, I think it's fair to say, unjustly condemned to death, and they try to break him out of prison. And he won't escape from prison. He could have. Why? Because he thinks that breaking the law is wrong, and you should never do a wrong. Socrates is ahead of the curve. So this is not the general view in Athens. This is Socrates who, in a very peculiar and unusual way, is sort of racing ahead, almost to sort of Christian times, and it's a Socratic argument. It's not the general view around. And he's insistent in arguing that, look, you never do anything bad to anyone. And this, of course, seems to me to be it's epitomized. It's conspicuous in Jesus and the Christian tradition. I'm missing a picture, but that's all right. I did want to show you, it's in other traditions as well. This is from the Analects. This is from Confucius. And Confucius has an idea of reciprocity. It's called the silver rule. Is there one word which may serve as a rule and practice for one's life? The master said, is not reciprocity such a rule? What you do not want done to yourself, do not do to others. So that's Confucian. This is a rabbi. That which is hateful to you, do not do to your fellow. That is the whole Torah. The rest is explanation. Go and learn. This is after Jesus, 7th century. And finally, this is from a Nigerian tribe. One who's to take a pointed stick to pinch a baby bird should first try it on himself to feel how it hurts. What I want to point out is that Christian rule about love, that we love people by practicing the golden rule and by loving them as we would like to be loved. It's there inherent, certainly in the philosophical tradition and in other traditions as well. But Jesus, in this very conspicuous, special way, is able to focus in on it and bring it to the fore and express in a wonderful way what many people now would say is at the very heart of morality. This is, of course, Jesus washing the feet and telling people that basically what we should do is we should have an ideal of service. When he had finished washing their feet, which is what the servants did, right? In Jewish times in the Holy Land, it was a very dusty kind of a place, and you would come in and the first thing they would do would be to wash your feet. So he washes their feet. Do you understand what I have done for you? He asked. You call me teacher and Lord, and rightly so, for that is what I am. Now that I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you should also wash one another's feet. And the idea seems to be that those who actually, like yourselves, because you're going to be important, influential, powerful people in the world, your job is not to rule over others, but to serve them. And the whole point of becoming a doctor is not to lord it over your patients, but in some sense to do what's good for them. Just very quickly, this is the diagram. This is Plato's Cave. And some of you, I'm sure, know about this. I'm not going to tell the story. What you need to know is that Plato thinks everybody's in a cave. It's all dark and dingy and nobody has the truth. And without going into the details, the whole point of philosophy is to get out here, get into the sunlight, and behold the proper truth, become a philosopher, capture wisdom, understand what's really true about the world. But the interesting thing is in the Republic, again, what does Socrates say? He says, once you've gotten out of the cave, you don't want to go back in, right? Because you're out in the sunshine and it's you've reached a state of truth which is so far beyond this. He says, the philosopher kings, because he thinks that the world should be ruled by philosophers. God help us. But what he says is, they must be made to descend again among the prisoners in the cave and partake of their labors and honors, whether they are worth having or not. You have to take the philosophers, you take them out of the cave, you teach them the bright light of truth, and then what do? You force them to go back and serve everybody else in the community, just like Jesus said about washing the feet. Their job now is, okay, you've had fun doing philosophy and whatever, go back into the cave and share in the labors and the honor and live in that dingy place and put up with being far away from the truth. Why? So that you can serve the people that are the people of the community, the people that you owe your allegiance to. Again, an idea of service, very much already there in the philosophical tradition. All right, this is Aristotle. This is probably the guy I spend most of my time studying. My students say I kind of look like him. Do I look like him? I don't know. He's more banged up, no? Anyways, so what I want to show you, and we'll talk a little bit more about this later on, I think perhaps because I'm trying to do what would interest you, and I think some of you probably have read C.S. Lewis, so maybe at one point we'll start and we'll look at C.S. Lewis, and I want to, I guess it's something lots of people like talking about. Actually, we have an expert here talk a bit about love and sexuality and that kind of things. When Socrates is brought before the court, he's asked to cease from doing philosophy. The reason he won't cease and desist from doing philosophy is because, and without going into all of the story, he believes the God, he uses the term in singular, the God has told him that it's his job to do philosophy. For Socrates, the point of doing philosophy is to make people more moral. It's not just a metaphysical pastime. It's not knowledge for knowledge's sake. It's about making people moral. And he's asked by the assembly at Athens, stop doing the philosophy. You're causing problems. It's irritating. There are all sorts of political problems at the time. And he says, if I have to choose between obeying God or man, I'm going to obey God. And, that's the end to it. And he says, I love Athens, and I'm happy to die for her, but I can't stop from doing what the God told me to do. So yes, and it depends with different philosophers, but there is a sense of transcendence that there's, for example, Epictetus. He talks about Zeus, but actually when you read, he has some prayers to Zeus, who was the head god, so to speak, Jupiter in the Roman times, but if I took some of the prayers and put them out, you'd think that they were Christian prayers. And with the Stoics, there's a sense that there's a providence, there's a caring, there's something higher than us that we have to submit to. So the cynic being flogged, he submits because there's an intelligence, a divinity in charge of the world, and that knows better than we know. And if he decides that you should be flogged, well, then that must be the right thing to do. So yes, there's a vertical kind of, not just a horizontal, but there's a vertical emphasis. And there's more to say. Maybe we'll say more as we go on. This is Aristotle. I want to basically talk about Aristotle's notion of friendship. And again, the point here is, look, if people beat you up for your religious beliefs, beat you up about Christianity, look, these are thinkers who weren't even Christian, and yet, isn't it remarkable that in some way or other, the logic, the reasoning, they didn't have revelation. What they had is serious, objective thinkers who sat down and talked about things, and yet they end up in many of the same places. So here's Aristotle. There's so much I could say about him. The first thing to notice is he says that love's not a feeling. Love is a character state. It looks as if love were a feeling, friendship a state of character. So I will talk more about the word here is probably eros. Mutual love involves choice, and choice springs from a state of character. And men wish well to those whom they love for their sake, not as a result of feeling, but as a result of a state of character. Okay, love involves choice. It's a matter of will. It's choosing. It's deciding to do something. Aristotle is what's called a virtue ethics. Some of you may have courses in biomedical ethics. I hope so, although sometimes those courses are worrisome in their own way. But they are. I know all about it. I've taught nursing ethics, for example, but I know what the usual kinds of courses are like. Aristotle wants to focus on virtue. What's important is not so much what you do, but what kind of person you are. So there's an ideal of morality, of, you could say, sanctity, holiness. And what do we have to? We have to develop a certain kind of character. And that character, this is important, those whom they love for their sake. The important thing about friendship is that you care about the other person for their own sake. The good man acts for honor's sake, and the more so, the better he is, and acts for his friend's sake and sacrifices his own interest. They throw away wealth. Friends throw away wealth too, on the condition that their friends will gain more. The same too is true of honor and office, and all these things he will sacrifice to his friend, for this is noble and laudable for himself. The main message here is that friendship, the kind of love that happens in friendship, is self-effacing. It's self-sacrificing. What you care about is you care about the other person. You do what's good for them, not what's good for you. And of course, this is a gospel theme. This is from John. No greater love has one than this, that someone lay down his life for his friends. And of course, the subject here is Jesus, who died on the cross for our sins and willingly died for us out of love, out of this kind of self-sacrificing love. Well, I mean, people don't realize this, and it's perhaps surprising. Aristotle, in a way, says the same thing. It is true of the good man, too, that he does many acts for the sake of his friends and his country, and if necessary, he dies for them. That is the ultimate love. I don't actually think that Aristotle's notion of friendship is quite as good as the Christian notion, as I'll talk about eventually. This is Epicurus, the hedonist. Some of you have heard about him. I just want to point out what Aristotle is saying, that if you really love somebody, you should be willing to die for them. This is Epicurus. Now, I don't think he has a very good argument. He's a hedonist. But even the Epicurean says the wise man will never give up a friend, and he will on occasion die for a friend. Doesn't that sound like Christianity? That basically you have this love that's so other-directed towards somebody else that you forget yourself and you're willing to give up your life even, which is the biggest price, right? You can't give up more than your life. You're willing to do that, not for your own sake, but for the sake of the other person, and that's the sign of the... This is Thomas Aquinas. Now, don't worry, I'm not going to talk about anything that's divisive, in terms of doctrine or whatever. He wrote, his most famous book is the Summa Theologia. It's really the summary or the introduction to theology. Why am I bringing him up? I'm not so much, it's not about doctrine or dogma or details of theology, because he's interesting in that he shows a way in which you can take secular philosophy, the best of the secular tradition, and you can take the Christian tradition and you can bring them together. And in fact, the best of the secular humanist tradition, all those ancient philosophers and whatever, in fact, it can be reconciled quite easily in an interesting way by Christianity. So he's an example of, he's a very serious believer, but he's a believer who discovers Aristotle when he's a young man. Aristotle, who is a pagan philosopher. Aristotle did believe in God, in one God, and we could talk about his views of God if you wanted, but still, he's clearly a pagan. What Aquinas does is he tries to take Aristotle and Christianity and put them together. And it provides sort of, like we don't have to, as Christians, be hostile to every element in humanistic culture or every element that comes from outside of Christianity. And so I'm just showing him there are other philosophers who do this in different ways, but he's just an interesting example of this. By the way, his real name is Thomas. It's not, everybody says Aquinas. Aquinas is where he's from. He's from the county Aquino. In the Middle Ages, you said, Louis from Calgary or Terry from Toronto. When you call him, Aquinas, you're really sort of saying like calling Terry Toronto. There's Toronto over there. His name is Thomas, really. So that's what I'm going to call him. And here we go. What I want to talk about is the three theological virtues. You know the three theological virtues, which are, guys? Faith, hope, and love. That's right. Oh, you cheated. Oh, well, it's already up there. Yeah, okay. Well, this is from 1 Corinthians. And this is the famous hymn of St. Paul to love. And he effectively says, in very beautiful language, he talks about how love is the most important virtue. See, there was a problem in the Middle Ages. So Thomas is back. He's being a scholar. He goes back and studies the ancient philosophers. The ancient philosophers, I think there's a sense, a notion of love, as you saw, for example, in Aristotle's notion of friendship. In fact, in a way, what Thomas does is he takes Aristotle's notion of friendship and he applies it to God. But Aristotle has a notion of virtues. He has a notion of what's called the cardinal virtues. And this is the typical way of thinking about virtue in the Western tradition. This is, again, a fresco and a mosaic in the Vatican called the Cardinal Virtues. And it's kind of fun. You know, I actually have a degree in art history, but art is interesting because it shows us where culture is. This is your cultural heritage. Like, people forget, not just within the church, but even outside of the church, certain ideas, certain themes have become, they're anchored inside our whole tradition. And you look at paintings from the Renaissance, so this is about 1500, Southern Italian Renaissance. And what do you see? Well, he's dealing actually with a moral theme. The moral theme is the cardinal virtues, but he sneaks in the theological virtues. So I'm going to have you help me find out.
What are the cardinal?
I'm going to tell you, Terry. So, does anybody know what the cardinal virtues are? You should know that. I mean,
But I don't. That's why.
No, not you, Terry. I'm just saying. The four cardinal virtues, Plato talks about them in the Republic too. What are they? They are justice. Justice is the virtue that deals with your relations to other people. So if you're a good person, you're just. Actually, for example, you're all going to be doctors or dentists. That's very important. In fact, I think I have a better slide of this. This is a copy, but you just see it better. This is Raphael's. It's a copy of Raphael's depiction of justice. This is just, morality 101, virtue ethics 101. What do you notice about justice? Why is she holding a sword? Because justice has to do with the law, and the law has the right to punish people. Our relations to other people are so important that in cases where people treat other people in a serious way, unjustly, we have a whole legal system with lawyers and courts and judges and, yes, Sugarland, jails, whatever, and we think it's incumbent upon us to enforce in a very serious way justice. There's a little tablet. Basically, it says, well, in fact, you see the scales? Justice measures out things according to their due proportion. I don't want to focus in on this because I want to focus in on how Thomas takes the theological virtues and adds them to the cardinal virtues. But okay, here's justice, temperance, basically getting your desires under control. That's the second cardinal virtue. Courage, standing up to difficult obstacles, to not being afraid, having perseverance, and prudence, or what Aristotle calls phronesis, practical wisdom. So justice, how you deal with other people; temperance, being disciplined so that you control your desires and they don't get out of hand; courage, so that you can stand up in the face of hardship and danger; and wisdom, which is the intelligence to basically live a good life and make the right decisions. And so the storyline is the ancient philosophers. Aristotle's got a very, very beautiful, well-worked theory about this, but he doesn't talk about the theological virtues. The theological virtues come from revelation, come from the tradition. And so what happens? This is Raphael. This is the fresco that's beneath the other one. And here are the other three cardinal virtues. So we have a woman here, and you'll notice there's some fire there. And what's she holding? She's holding reins. What do you use reins for on a horse? To pull back the horse, right? To stop the horse, to break the horse. This represents temperance. We have to learn at various points of our lives to pull back, to stop ourselves from indulging in pleasures that are destructive or hurtful or immoral, whatever. You see the lady here. Do you know what she's got on her lap there? Can you see it? Well, there's a tree. There's an oak tree. That's right. What's an oak tree? Is it a strong tree or a weak tree? It's a strong tree. It's the strongest tree. There's a lion. I don't know if you can make the head of a lion on her. And what is this here? She's got armor on. So what does she represent? Courage. There. So we've got temperance here, telling us to hold back from the fire of our desires, which will burn us up if we're not careful. We have fortitude. And does anybody see what the muse at the top? She's the most important cardinal virtue. She's the highest. What's she doing? She's looking in a mirror. Why would prudence, practical wisdom be looking in a mirror? Because for the ancient Greeks, the inscription above the temple at Delphi was, "Know thyself." The way to wisdom is to understand your own nature. And so what do we have? We've got prudence, and she's looking in a mirror. She's got sort of a tragic face. You can't see it, but a tragic face on her blouse, because experience is often painful, and we learn through painful experience to be wiser about things. But so we have this fresco, and we've got the cardinal virtues. And what happens? Thomas comes along, and actually Raphael knows all about Thomas. He's an Italian artist, and Thomas is very famous. Justice is on top. These are to the side. But Raphael knows about the theological virtues. What Thomas says is, okay, we've got the cardinal virtues. Notice, he doesn't say that they're bad. He says they're good. But he says that the basis of virtue is in the theological virtues, the three virtues of faith, hope, and charity, or faith, hope, and love. And so what he does is he takes Aristotle's ethics. He doesn't say it's wrong. He says it's right. It's pretty good. But we can understand it better if we add a higher level of virtues that come out of revelation, having to do with faith, hope, and love. And what he says is, in effect, he says, love, charity, that is the highest, the most important, the source, the origin, if you will, of morality. But he doesn't redo Aristotle's, secular morality. What he says is basically, here's a way of understanding it better. It's a way of understanding it better. There's a fundamental difference between the theological virtues and the regular virtues. Aristotle talked about the golden mean. I won't say much about it, but he thought you had to aim at the right amount of things. What Thomas comes along and he says is basically you can't have too much faith, you can't have too much hope, you can't have too much love. And mostly, as in 1 Corinthians, love is the most important thing. Love comes from God and joins us to God, and it is epitomized, embodied in the world. And the way to understand the ancient virtues is to understand that at this higher level, there's love, and which is basically Aristotle's notion of friendship between human beings, but most importantly, between God and the world. But let's get back to actually the theological virtues are here too. So here we have somebody in the Renaissance, actually, just the beginning of the Enlightenment, and the putti, the angels, represent the theological virtues. So let's look at the angels. You can figure out which is which. You see the little putti there? We've got temperance here, and there's a little angel, and he's pointing heavenward. And what does he represent? That's right. He represents faith. Why does he represent faith? That's because faith is believing in what's invisible, what we can't see, what's to come, believing in heaven and the world hereafter. This angel right here, he's holding a torch. What do we use a torch for? To light up the dark way. hope. And this is Raphael's representation of hope, that in the darkness of, our often suffering lives, we need hope to carry us on. This is love. Do you know what love's doing? He's picking acorns. The idea is supposed to be is, how can you tell about love? You can tell love, you can discern it, you can discover it by its fruits. It's by what people do, by the way in which, this is of course the gospel message. So here we have, it's reaching up, sort of on the lap of courage, fortitude. And what you get is a nice sort of bringing together of the secular humanist tradition and the theological tradition. And they're not at odds with one another in this kind of late medieval, early Renaissance synthesis. Thomas would talk about good works, right? And the idea would be that according to justice, we can talk more about this after the break, and we can talk more about it. In fact, I have sort of a medical epilogue for doctors, and I'm sorry I couldn't find much about dentists, but I'll stick dentistry in somehow. But the idea would be that each individual person has a vocation that's picked out by God, and justice means doing whatever your particular task is. So the bricklayer has a different task than the carpenter, which has a different task than the philosophy professor, which has a different task than the dentist. But the way the world is ordered, to make sense of everything as a whole, as the community as a whole, love here is going out and doing something practical. It's, I don't know how much I want to say about this. In the tradition, there's a debate about which is the better kind of life, the contemplative life or the what's called the political life, the life of action. In fact, they're Latin terms, the via contemplativa or the via activa. And the philosophers, of course, not surprisingly, and even Thomas, actually, the Christian theologian, said the contemplative life, the life of study, the life of sitting by yourself and thinking great thoughts, or of reading books, or of reading the Bible, that's the great life. In fact, it's interesting because Raphael here, he's showing love as epitomized by the practical life. The political life is the life that most of you are going to lead. Going out in the community, it just means politics in the sense of, Aristotle defines human beings as politikon zoon, political animals, social animals, gregarious animals. We're meant to live together. And so what Raphael does here is he's depicting love, but love is going out and doing something, making a difference into the world. Here is love picking the acorns. It's not, it's kind of interesting because he could have taken and put love beside prudence. Because this is the thoughtful one, right? This is sort of associated with philosophy and theology and whatever. But he doesn't. In fact, and he puts love next to courage. Almost, it seems serendipitous. I think you have to have a lot of courage to go out and be a good Christian doctor or a good Christian dentist today. But in effect, what you're doing when you're being loving in your practice is you are putting in practice this moral schema, this moral framework, but which again, it's not so much that it detracts from, if you will, the secular morality. And Thomas says, religious morality, it's different than secular morality, and it goes a little bit further. It demands a little bit more. Because we have revelation, we have religious obligations, and we have a Savior that died for us on the cross. And so what religious morality, it pushes you even further in that direction of self-giving, self-sacrificing love. But it doesn't negate secular, natural morality. Ordinary non-Christian or non-religious or non-believing people, they believe in honesty. They believe in, in charity. They believe, and so on and so forth, in the thing, in keeping your promises, in that you shouldn't murder other people, and so on and so forth. And the interesting thing about Thomas is that he's adding this Christian theological framework on top of the other one, not denying it, but using it to push us even further in a moral direction. The word he uses, we'll talk about words after the break, but is caritas. That's where we get our word charity. But charity is not a very good interpretation, because we think of charity as giving money to the poor. That's good. That's a good thing to do. But it's a much deeper sort. The idea here is the Greek word agape, which I will talk about after the break with C.S. Lewis. Love that's giving rather than receiving. Love that's focused on pouring outward towards other people without thinking of it itself. That is what he means by the love and the theological virtues. But why don't we take a break? You've been very patient, and we'll talk about C.S. Lewis after the break.